Thank you very much, Professor Kyoto, for that very kind introduction, and also to the graduate school for this extremely welcome invitation to address you about UK energy policy. As you'll see, my title today is Economic Hazards of Forced Energy Transition, and the note I wish to strike is a cautionary note. Things are not necessarily positive in this sector. We've learned a lot over the last 10 years. Much of it is very dispiriting and discouraging, and it requires, necessitates a considerable rethink in the way that we plan to produce a low-carbon economy. The material I'm going to show you is entirely from the UK's own experience, because it's very detailed and empirical, and therefore particularly useful. So the talk outline has two parts, really. There's a survey of UK energy and climate policy. I talk about the character of the UK electricity sector, renewables deployment and costs, and adequacy as a climate policy. And particularly, I'm going to talk about new directions in UK policy. And then at the end, I'll talk about hidden dangers of energy policies and costs. This is effectively, it's a perspective from thermodynamics, talking about low productivity energy sources implying poverty, and why it's so important that renewable energy sources become much more productive, if indeed they are going to deserve a place in our economy. But, yeah. So firstly, let's begin with a speech made 2 days ago only by the Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change in the British government, Amber Rudd. This speech has been long expected, and as expected, it has made a significant, indeed a major, redirection of UK policy. It's been widely reported in the press, and it's highly controversial. Coal is to close by 2025. That actually is not really news. That's the headline story. That's what's being projected. It'll be replaced with gas generation, and I give you some quotes from the speech so you can see in her own words how firm this is. Gas is central to our energy secure future. And it will be replaced, she hopes, with new nuclear generation. She says, opponents of nuclear have misread the science. It is safe and reliable. And there will be a consultation on strategy to maximise the economic recovery of the North Sea. In other words, more gas and oil. Now you might say that this is not so much a climate policy as an energy policy. It is certainly a policy for economic growth. This is a very new tone from the UK government. It's been building up ever since the election in May, and it was expected. But I have to say the strength of the message, that surprises even me a little. And on renewables, she has this to say. Offshore wind is still too expensive. We will not support offshore wind at any cost. This is a very strong message. No more blank cheques. Onshore wind cost reductions will trigger support cuts. Clear statement, subsidies should be temporary, not part of a permanent business model. This is a radical change. And system costs, this is a dramatic hint, a very important one. System costs. We want intermittent generators to be responsible for the pressures they add to the system. It's been a major complaint in the UK that renewables increase system costs, but they don't pay them. The UK government is now proposing that they should have to pay their way in the system. This will focus minds in the renewables industry, believe me. And there's a new emphasis on invention and innovation. She says, let's be honest with ourselves. We don't have all the answers to decarbonisation today. We must develop technologies that are both cheap and green. In other words, we don't have technologies that are cheap and green today, and they're not set to be cheap and green in the future. We need a radical invention and innovation policy. All this, to me, is very welcome. It's the sort of thing I've been saying for the last 10 years. Let's look at the background now to this major change. What has driven Amber Rudd and the UK government into this position? And very bluntly, I'll summarise it for you. The previous policy track was too expensive, dangerously expensive. I'm going to try and give you some background to the UK electricity sector and also to what the Renewables Directive from the European Union proposed to do to it. The Renewables Directive of 2009 is the fundamental driver of UK energy policy, or at least it was until 2 days ago, when Amber Rudd's announcement seems to suggest that this directive is now less important. The UK burden share of that 20% target is that we should have 15% of final energy consumption by 2020. We have one of the largest multiple increases of any major state. That's principally because we cleaned up our energy sector with gas, both in domestic heating and electricity, very early. So we had very low renewables base. For those of you who are familiar policy people, familiar with policy design, you can see that this is a target of a percentage of an unknown quantity. It's a very unwise way to design a policy. You should set a firm target, not a percentage of a quantity you don't know, you can't predict. But anyway, I can't give you a precise figure for it, but I can tell you it'll be somewhere between 230 and 270 terawatt hours of renewable electricity by 2020. The approximate, renewable energy. The approximate composition will be about 45 terawatt hours of transport fuel, 120 of electricity, which will be about 30% of UK electricity, and about 70 terawatt hours heating and cooling. Transport fuel is mandatory. There's some flexibility about electricity, heating and cooling. And in fact, this is behind schedule, but electricity is way ahead of schedule. We have a massive overshoot of a renewable electricity building. Now, as you will know, the UK is marked by its emphasis on liberal markets in practically every area of life, and indeed for the liberalisation of the electricity market. So the European Union target represents a very significant state intervention into a system which is usually thought of as being fundamentally a liberal market. However, the truth is that history is rather complicated. We started off with a nationalised industry from 45 to 90, and then from 90 to 2001 we had a period of liberalisation and privatisation. The Central Electricity Generating Board was broken up into vertically integrated utility companies, into a national grid, and distribution network operators. There was major growth in the use of combined cycle gas turbines during this period. Privatisation reached its peak in about 2001 with the electricity trading arrangements, NETA as they're sometimes called, and they introduced bilateral trading. It's a very interesting market. But even as the liberalisation period reached its peak, climate change policies appeared on the scene and very rapidly turned that around. So it's not that the change in heart in the UK about liberalisation is not recent, it started back in 2000. So even in 2001, 2002, we were starting to reintroduce state management, and the renewables obligation was introduced in 2002. So many of the charges imposed on the customer today are not the result of wholesale price, but of climate and other policies. So here is a typical day in the UK. So you have half hours across the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis you have megawatts, and you can see the load is met by a mixture of nuclear, that's the purple colour, black is coal, gas, there's biomass, the light yellow is wind in this case, and then there's a mixture of hydro, interconnectors and other renewables at the top. You see, we are an afternoon peaking system, and the peak load in the UK in the winter is about 60 gigawatts. On this slide it's about 40. Minimum load in the UK is something like 25, 30 gigawatts in the summer. And this is a very typical day, except that the wind is quite consistent on this day. Obviously the wind goes up and down. You'll notice that load following is done largely by gas. So insofar as wind is displacing fossil fuels, it's basically displacing gas, which has a significant impact on its emission saving cost. This is the UK electricity fuel mix from 2009 to 15. And by the way, these charts are from our website. We have a very large user configurable database. You can just go on and play with it to make these sorts of charts for yourself. Nuclear share is fairly consistent. Coal, as you see, rose embarrassingly in 2012, and the reason for that is policy. There was a conflicting policy agenda. The Large Combustion Plant Directive, an environmental directive, and the Carbon Price Floor, an environmental directive, combined to create a perverse incentive to burn coal. Policy design is very difficult, one must be careful. Anyway, coal rose at that period, but as you can see, it's now falling away, and Amber Rudd says everything will close by 2025. gas was a major part of our electricity. It contracted, and it still has not completely recovered. Part of this is because of the increase in renewables and in imports from France and Holland, but a large part of it is because of demand. Electricity demand in the UK is weak because of economic downturn. Let's look at the top slice on those charts. Let's look at the renewables sector and the imports. Big stories here are the growth in wind. This is years across the bottom, and a percentage share of demand. So this is of energy, megawatt hours. And growth in wind, very significant. It's now getting on for 8% of demand annually. But notice also the big stories here, the interconnectors. That's the dark dotted line is the French interconnector, and the orange dotted line, the Dutch interconnector. And between them, they add about another 8% of demand. So yes, wind has increased dramatically, but in fact one of the biggest stories is we're now importing about 8% of our electricity from France and the Netherlands, which is fine, because the price is advantageous. No problem with importing at a good price. Let's look again at the electricity fuel mix, renewables and interconnectors, this time in gigawatt hours, so this is quantity of energy, just not percentage of demand. Major growth in wind, but also look at that, very significant growth in biomass. What makes that story so interesting is that basically one power station. That's Drax, the largest thermal generator in the UK and one of the largest in Western Europe, if not the largest. And it's now burning a lot of wood, a great deal of wood indeed. Some people say unsustainably large quantities of wood. And you see there's very significant growth in the interconnectors alongside that growth in wind and others. This year, of course, 15 is lower because it's not yet finished. This is up-to-date data. So there's the background. We're basically a fossil fuel system with significant amounts of renewables and major imports now emerging. So our electricity target is for about 120 terawatt hours per year, which is about 30% of UK electricity. How are we doing? How are we getting along? Well, this chart by us shows the target area up here. As I told you, it can't be precisely defined. It's something like 120. And then you've got years across the bottom. And this is empirical data. The blue line is all renewables. The green line is subsidized renewables. The difference between them is unsubsidized. As you'll see, there's been no significant growth in unsubsidized renewables, and if anything, a slight contraction for rather peculiar reasons, which I won't explain. This is the 2010 target, which we missed by a large margin. And that red line is just a linear growth from 2009 up to the 2020 target. We're a little bit behindhand, but basically on schedule. And this is very significant growth for us. So we're now generating something like 60 terawatt hours per year from renewables, most of it subsidized. But that growth has come at a very significant cost. This is cost per year. Started off at about £400 million. It's now well over 3 billion, and indeed our estimate for this year, 15, is about 4 billion, and it will rise to roughly 8 billion pounds per year in 2020. That's about 0.5% of annual GDP in the UK. It is a very significant additional cost to the UK consumer. And the cumulative cost, the area under the chart, is about 15 billion pounds. So the annual estimate in 14-15 is 4 billion, and the cumulative cost obviously is going to be rising much, much faster. So let's suppose we persist with our aims to meet the 2020 target, and Amberrad has not said that we won't, although one can infer that there are some problems. Let's say we persist with our aim and then stop in 2020. Say we don't award any new subsidy contracts. This is a way of estimating the cumulative cost to the consumer of this policy. This data is empirical. This is modelled on the Department of Energy's projected fuel mix of a few years ago. Fuel mix changes a lot, so I can't say that this is exactly what it would be today. If anything, it would be more today, because there's more solar and there's more offshore wind in the mix. But this is the fuel mix that was used in the Renewable Energy Roadmap in the UK. So we can see that annual subsidy cost is about 8 billion a year in 2020, and then it falls away as the subsidy contracts expire. Remember, I'm assuming we don't build any more renewables. So we meet the target, but we don't try to keep on meeting the target. We go back to doing something else, perhaps fossil fuels. The cumulative cost there is 162 billion in all. This is a lot of money. It implies an extraordinarily large opportunity cost. These are resources that could go into something else. So you're looking at a major impact on the UK economy, and it's quite possible that the public would wish you to do something else with these resources. They may not wish you to give it to low productivity energy sources. They may wish to use it for other purposes. Even the Department of Energy admits that these subsidies would have very significant impacts on the electricity price in the UK. In the low fossil fuel price scenario of the government for domestic households, the assumption is that the policies would add 42%, about £55 a megawatt hour, 42% price increase to prices to domestic households in 2020. In the low fossil price scenario for medium-sized businesses, it would be about plus 77%. These are enormous increases. And of course, the increases to businesses will hit households indirectly through other costs of living. All costs of goods and services will rise, and there's a downward pressure on wages and rates of employment. Most significantly of all, even in the high fossil fuel price scenario, which now seems very unlikely, the price of fossil fuels seem likely to be low for quite some time to come. Even in a high fossil fuel price scenario, prices will rise between 30 to 45% because of policies. In other words, the policies give no real protection against high fossil fuel prices, even if fossil prices are very high. That's extraordinary. But you may say, well, the point is, it's got to be a climate policy. We need a climate policy. It may be economically damaging, perhaps you just have to do it. But even as a climate policy, these costs are obviously dispiriting and dangerous. Let's think about the CO2 abatement cost in the UK. Now, I've calculated these in pounds and then converted them into dollars so that it's relatively easy for you to compare them with figures you may have seen elsewhere. Roof-mounted solar PV in the UK has an abatement cost of somewhere between $380 per tonne and $1,450 per tonne. These are very high prices. The subsidy for solar PV was 10 times the wholesale price when it was first introduced, so subsidy cost is too high. Freestanding solar PV, about $228. Small onshore wind, $608. Large onshore wind, about $137. So just look at the big technologies. Dedicated biomass, offshore wind, well over $100. Offshore wind, nearly $300 per tonne. These are all well in excess of any rational social cost of carbon. And you can see I've got a range up here from a well-known article, Martin, $0 up to $206. So looking at this, if you're worried about climate change, you should say, well, these policy costs are too high. This is not an economically compelling example to the developing world. Indeed, it is not an economically compelling example to British citizens. Indeed, on these sorts of costs, it would be rational to prefer climate change. And that obviously cannot be correct. This is too expensive. There are another range of social costs of CO2. UK wind costs, like I said, has been 137, 274, 228, 380 for solar, all well in excess of the US EPA social cost of carbon estimates. And this is a major problem. We need much cheaper emission saving if this is to be economically compelling or to be sustainable with our own populations. But there are deeper problems to what we've been doing. Introducing renewables, uncontrollable renewables to the system implies very significant operating costs. And you've seen that Amber Rudd is now saying that the renewables should pay for these operating costs, which would be very frightening to. I'm using here estimates by a man called Colin Gibson. He was a former power networks director for National Grid in the UK. One of the most respected power systems engineers, who also happens to be a very good economist. And he produced papers for the Institution of Engineers and Shipbuilders in Scotland. It's an ancient learned society, estimating the additional system costs. It's a very sophisticated piece of work, and I do recommend you look at it. he reckoned that the system costs, over and above the system cost of conventional generation, was about plus £75 for onshore wind, plus £64 for offshore wind. Now, that is more than the subsidy in the case of onshore wind, and not far short of it in offshore wind. Wholesale price, bear in mind, is £50 a megawatt hour in the UK. So even if the onshore wind turbines, the offshore wind turbines were £0 to install, in other words, they were free, the electricity they generated would still be more expensive than combined cycle gas turbines at current gas prices. An extraordinary thought. Let's add those system costs into my subsidy cost cumulative chart, and you can now see that it tops 13 billion, nearly 14 billion in 2020 per year. That's about 1% of GDP. This is a large sum. And the cumulative cost is now about 256 billion. Could easily be much higher with solar costs. Solar is now 8 gigawatts in the UK, and we're worried about integration costs from solar now. And there is enormous growth potential for renewables due to the overheating of the sector. The subsidies are so generous, we have a lot of capacity waiting to be built. Now this chart is ours from government data. You won't find this on the government side, but you can find the numbers which allow you to make this chart. So the green bar indicates the capacity which has been targeted in the National Renewable Energy Action Plan of 2010. The blue bar is what was actually operational in 2014, and the red bar is the quantity in the blue bar plus what has been given permission. So it has planning consent. It can be built. It has not been built yet, but can be built. So you can see that we planned for 15 gigawatts of onshore wind. We already have more than 15 gigawatts consented. We have 8 operational. We planned for about 13 offshore. We have about 5 operational, and we have about 20 consented, a very big overshoot. We had about 5 planned for biomass, about 6 operational in 2014, and we have about 10 consented, another big overshoot. In solar, we planned for about 3. We actually have, that figure is now out of date, it's actually nearly 8 gigawatts of solar. This figure changes very rapidly. And we have 8 consented, and indeed there is more being consented all the time. So there's a very big overshoot here. So we have about 54 gigawatts of capacity consented, of which 23 is operational, including about 20 gigawatts of offshore wind. And you can see those figures there. The output from the consented capacity would be about 155 terawatt hours, so 40% in excess of target. And there is no budget for this. It would imply an additional spend of something like £2 billion. There is no budget for this. And this is one of the reasons why Her Majesty's Treasury has simply said, stop. You cannot go on, as Amber Rudd said, writing a blank cheque for this industry. You've got to tell them to grow up. These subsidies simply have to be controlled. So the high costs jeopardize climate change policies. I mean, it's rational to have an insurance policy, but climate policy must, like any insurance policy, pass 3 tests. It must offer real cover against hazard. The premium must be intrinsically affordable, and the premium must be proportional to the risk, scale of the hazard times the probability. Current renewables policies in the UK, and I suspect almost globally, fail all 3 tests. What we need, as Amber Rudd said, is a new emphasis on invention and innovation to produce fundamentally economically clean energy. And we need to replace deployment subsidies with a carbon tax, perhaps, an R&D strategy. The replacement is not entirely clear. We have to be creative about this. It's going to be very difficult, particularly because we've now created so many vested interests in the renewables industry. We've had an orgy of economic rent-seeking, and it's going to be very difficult to unwind that, but it will have to be done. Now, behind that obvious and simple list of problems with our policies, there is something deeper. Energy is not an ordinary economic input. And politicians tinker with it, they fiddle with it, they increase costs at their peril. At our peril, in fact. In the UK, we already have a dangerously high transport fuel tax, about 27 billion a year. If you were looking for explanations for UK economic underperformance, apart from the fact that we're incredibly lazy and and very undisciplined, this would be a very good candidate. This is a major drag on the UK economy. If the Chancellor wanted a boom, he could cut UK transport fuel tax. It would be a very good thing to do. But the renewables policies are already a significant drag, and they're projected to become much more so. Treasury is already worried about this. I've already made those costs clear to you. Energy is no ordinary input. There is really no excuse for not knowing this. This is Jevons, the great British energy economist from the 19th century, writing in his book The Coal Question in 1865. Coal, by which we can read energy, because he knew of no other kind, dense stocks of energy rather than low-density flows. He's thinking of the difference in the industrial economy and the pre-industrial economy. Coal, in truth, stands not beside, but entirely above all other commodities. It is the material energy of the country, the universal aid. With coal, almost any feat is possible or easy. Without it, we are thrown back into the laborious poverty of early times. And this view is now underpinning a complete rethinking of the causes of the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom. And here is a book by the great British demographer and economic historian Anthony Wrigley, Sir Anthony Wrigley, Master of Corpus Christi, Cambridge. Energy in the English Industrial Revolution. It's a short book, I commend it to you. Wrigley writes in this book, reinforcing Jevons's point, that the laborious poverty to which most men and women were condemned did not arise from lack of personal freedom, from discrimination, or from the nature of the political or legal system. It sprang from the nature of all organic economies. The plant growth in question, the renewable flow, represented the bulk of the sum total of energy which could be made available for any human purpose. Previous societies were oppressive, very unfree, and they were discriminatory, not because the people were wicked, but because they were poor. They simply didn't have enough energy to create wealth. Coal changed this. It permitted the social changes that we've seen since then. Essentially, what Wrigley is saying, and implied in Jevons, is related to energy return on energy invested. It's energy productivity. Organic economies have a low energy return on energy invested, and it leads to general poverty. That small surplus of energy over that required to constitute and maintain the energy sector. So the energy sector in an organic economy, pre-industrial economy, is a large part of the economy. It employs most of the people on very low wages, and there's a very small surplus for doing other things. Fossil economies have a completely different structure. The energy sector itself is a relatively small part of the economy. It produces a great surplus of energy over that required for the sector itself, and this leads to general wealth, which we see around us. And indeed, as Wrigley points out, many, to my mind, highly desirable social changes. Why would we want to go backwards? A policy-driven energy transition to a low productivity system, i.e. the kind of capital-intensive, low load factor renewable systems that we've tried to use in the UK and are planned for other parts of Europe, but not now likely to do well in the UK, will entail wealth destruction. It's a completely different economic structure. You have much less capital outside the energy sector. And you have less surplus for immediate consumption. You will imply very significant reductions in standard of living. And that, of course, makes a climate policy based on such technologies vulnerable to public pushback. If you want these policies to be sustainable, you've really got to allow people to maintain their standard of living. And, of course, also a very important concentration of wealth in the energy sector with major political implications. If you have investments in the energy sector in this new renewable economy, you're going to be very rich and powerful. If you don't, you're not. The green future, as we currently see it, is socially and economically a return to the past. This must be avoided at all costs. Hence, the sort of change of heart we're seeing in Amber Rudd's statement and the emphasis on invention and innovation to try to produce fundamentally economic low-carbon technologies, without which no climate policy has any sustainable future. Thank you very much.